And I said, big up Kubara and the NUBIART show, giving a different perspective on Africa and the African world. Love.
Yo, this is Tony Roughcut, and remember the boat is Sound Radio. I listen to Wicked, your local radio station.
NUBIART, a different perspective on the African world. My guest is Deng from the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. So I'm just going to let him introduce himself and then going to give you a little bit about the history, culture, and situation in Sudan. Deng.
Thank you very, very much, my brother Kubara, and for giving me this opportunity to share with the wider community some of the historical and contemporary experiences. And my name is Deng Ajak. I've been a member of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, SPLM, since its formation, and an activist as well as a refugee here in the UK. It will be my pleasure to share with you the earlier historical foundations or genesis of these very tragic experiences that we are living to this very day, and the contemporary context of that in not only Sudanese or African Sudanese local issues, but in the wider regional, continental, and global African and international contexts as well. So be with us, as Brother Kubara said. We will share with you as we go along.
Perhaps you could, for those people who maybe don't know where Sudan is, could you give us a rough geography of where it is?
Yes, Sudan is the largest country in Africa in terms of area. It's just south of Egypt, in the northeastern part of Africa and Central Africa, and is bordered by roughly 9 countries. In addition to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Central African Republic, Chad, and in small strip, Libya. It's a microcosm, so to speak, of the African continent in terms of the ethnic formation of the Sudan, where the majority of it are of the African stock, partly that some of them are Islamized and the rest are Arabized Africans, though they may refer to themselves as Arabs in many situations. Yes, also it is true that the Sudan is influenced by some Arab culture to some extent, and it is seen as a bridge between the African and Arab worlds. The question was about the location of Sudan in terms of geography, but I thought it may be a good idea for me to expand it and share with you some of these other details, so that it jolts the imagination or knowledge of the audience into where Sudan really is and what is its formation.
Okay, thanks, yeah. Could you give us some history of the Sudan? And also, like, some people know Sudan under different names as well, yeah. So if you could just give us the history from how you know the first of the Sudan.
Historically, actually, the name Sudan was known for all the southern strip of the Saharan and Sub-Saharan region of Africa one time. But the modern Sudan is an Anglo-Egyptian formation since the occupation of Sudan under the condominium in 1898. Sudan became to be known with its present borders. Before that, that area saw many civilizations and legacies come and go, beginning with the earliest of them all being Kush and the kingdom of Nubia, some thousands of years ago before Christ. And the Sudan of today is rather a complex picture of the dynamics of human interactions that existed in that part of the world over the centuries, to be precise, perhaps about 1500 years ago. And it saw the earliest waves of contacts with the Arab world, and at a later date the colonial conquests and up to this very moment the new colonial dynamics in that country, as is the case actually with all other African states. So one of the most crucial aspects that are missing people's collective consciousness or imagination, so to speak, it is seen as part of the Middle Eastern structure which is emerging in recent years, and not perhaps as part of the African world proper, politically and culturally speaking. Hence the conflicts that are taking place in the Sudan since 55. This is a recent civil war which stopped at 72 and began again at 83, continuing up to this very moment. So these are the factors. The processes of Islamization and Arabization have in many ways shaped up the character of Sudan locally, regionally and continentally. But this is under serious contest by virtue of the fact that there has been a civil war to determine the terms of relations in a more clear, equitable, just and open way between all the constituent members of that society. So the Sudan, in terms of outlook now, under the present regime, which in many ways is trying to eliminate, so to speak, the African element within Sudan and ensure the further Arabization, Islamization, and there are strong evidence to support the view that even the annihilation of the rest of Africans in that country. That is very, very, very clear. But of late, the understanding has been increasingly realized that it can't continue this way for too long, and better constructs for that country that accommodate all its members will have to be looked into. Hence, the key policies of the SPLM as a movement, that it aspires to the creation of a new Sudan, which is united, secular, a just Sudan for all its members, where there is complete respect and recognition of each and every individual's human rights of all its members, and to restructure the body politics of the country in a way that will not only stabilize the Sudan as a country, but also to contribute towards the wider stability of the region, and which will definitely reflect itself continentally and beyond. So the formation of today's Sudan has been actually complicated by the ever-intensifying processes and incursions of Islamization and Arabization at the expense of African lands, resources, peoples, and culture. And it's about time that is to be looked into in greater details. That is at one level. At another level, I would wish to discuss the historical foundations of this, and as to how Islam as a body of beliefs and ideas, as well as a religion, has actually provided the philosophical and ideological foundations, not only for the wave of slavery that is happening in today's Sudan, but in the wave of slavery that in many ways began before the European slavery and impact of enslavement in Africa, and the influences of that which we see up to this very moment.
Thanks, Deng. Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that, because I see a lot of different definitions for Africa, where you have what's called North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, as if nobody lives in the Sahara, and also this notion of Black Africa south of the Sahara. Now, I mean, my understanding is that, like, for there to be something that can be classed as a Black Africa, it implies that part of Africa is white or belongs to white people or whatever, people who are not Africans, I suppose, you know. So, you know, could you maybe go into how, like, living in Sudan, which is one of those countries which is in the Sahara, your experiences of living in the place that is actually seen as the border of Africa?
This is a very interesting question, because it will bring us to the issue of the color politics. And in this I recall very much our elder and late and great activist, Du Bois, when he spoke of the shades of the color in determining human relations and so forth. In fact, before the African encounter with Europe, the consciousness of this color line, or the politics of who's white and who's black and so forth, actually started with the Arab-African encounter, not less than 700 years before the European encounter. And when the European came, it was just a relay or a takeover, if I borrow the words of Professor Herbert Ekwekwe, and continued with that legacy. That is exactly the case. Yes, the question that supposes that there is a black Africa and a white Africa, it confuses a lot of the dynamics of human relations that existed in that part of the world for nearly the past 1,500 years, as I said earlier. There's no question or doubt about the fact, irrespective of what the Arab countries in Northern Africa may claim to be, there's no doubt about the fact that these are African lands which are occupied by Arabs as a result of continuous invasions and incursions into African lands. I found it rather interesting. Someone like a Muslim scholar called Yusuf Qaradawi spoke very recently that even Eritrea is an Arab Muslim land. So the incursions are taking place. Sudan is under dispute. Many of the other countries are under dispute that they are to become Arab countries rather than African states proper. That is at one level. At another level, there's also this notion of whiteness and blackness. For instance, the whiter you are in terms of skin color, so sadly, a ridiculous notion as that may be, that you are essentially a better person or you are to have a better social status and so forth. That is just a false notion or a false sense of superiority which does not have any clear-cut scientific, social, moral, or historical evidence to support it in any way whatsoever. But what needs to happen, it is the individual's humanity and personality that counts as to how good he or she is to himself and the wider community as well as the wider humanity. Yes, this politics of color, i.e. white and black, exists and is still determining the terms of relations, not only within Sudan, but also in countries like Egypt. For instance, if we go to Egypt today and look into the audiovisual media, we see black people are represented as either domestic servants, cooks, or doorkeepers. We have hardly seen a black person in any of the films or the popular or even political leadership who has any position of weight or recognition. So yes, these are the things which needs to be looked into in more minute details and ask ourselves conscious questions as to what is the future of humanity and the future of civilizations are likely to be if such notions continue to inform as well as determine the day-to-day terms of human relations.
Okay, I'm interviewing Deng from the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, yeah? And he's just given a brief history and some of the current situations and what's leading up to the problems that are going on in Sudan at the moment, where for those people who have been following things up, you'll know that there's been quite a few successes for the people who represent the Sudanese way of life, you know? And I'm just going to get Deng to just expand on any of the up-to-date information he has on how the liberation struggle in Sudan has been progressive.
The latest developments, politically speaking, have been very promising indeed. And the hopes are very high now that a settlement to the whole situation is likely to come sooner than otherwise would have been expected. Also, that has been reinforced by military successes on the ground, and one speaks about the military successes with a sinking heart, so to speak, in some respects, because at the end of the day, it is our people on the ground, from whichever side, that are going to be the actual losers. So the latest developments, especially the recent agreement that took place in Asmara and so forth, that has provided the blueprint of how the vision of making a new Sudan is likely to be actualized. In terms of how the arrangements can take place thereafter, these are still subjects for debates and discussions and so forth. Nevertheless, the NIF regime or the National Islamic Front government is still firmly in power, is still actively involved in the enslavement of our people in all sorts of places. The destruction of communities is still taking place, and through aerial bombardments and things like that. So the war is still intense in many ways, despite these hopeful signs that in the interim period as well as the post-interim period arrangements, there is some glimmer of hope is beginning to emerge ever more clearer than at any time before. So at a regional level, the NIF is increasingly becoming isolated with all the neighboring countries. They are no longer seen as a serious government for anyone to do serious business with. In fact, President Museveni of Uganda went as far as making a call that the struggle in Sudan will have to be seen as a colonialist struggle, such that that will open up the way for all Africans in the continent to help, and for that matter, all Africans also outside the continent to come up with whatever practical help that they can come up with in order to mobilize Africans, all non-Africans around the world, around the struggles of the Sudanese people. That is at one level. At another level, there has been restructuring in the political leadership of the SPLM itself with a view to embrace these changes with an open heart and open mind in order to lay very firm foundations and very solid grounds for the changes to come. Because at the end of the day, we will all believe that lasting political solutions that can bring into being genuine stability and genuine peace and progress to that part of the world. Because some may argue that as far as the Arabized side is concerned, to them it is just an issue of ceasefire in order to restart the aggressive Islamization and Arabization and misappropriation of African lands and resources and so forth. Yes, that may be true, but I don't think there is any illusion or there is any confusion about the fact that the resolve and determination is very, very strong indeed to ensure that none of the old mistakes will repeat themselves. None of the old shortcomings and misgivings will repeat themselves in any way. So one of the greatest things, perhaps throughout the history of Sudan in recent decades, before or even after the so-called independence, the SPLM perhaps has laid down some of the most solid institutions to oversee the processes of implementing all these ideas. But yet there are still difficulties that are facing these institutions for them to realize their objectives in the fullness of, call them potentiality or whatever. But these are problems to be dealt with as they come, and the task ahead actually is even more greater and more demanding than perhaps the war effort itself, because it will be an issue of how to lay stronger foundations, as I said earlier, to maintain these successes that have been achieved and to ensure that they're not going to be repeated, and for us not to enter into yet again another cycle of civil war and perhaps wider war in that region along Arab-African lines proper. So this is the latest developments, and the challenge to do that is increasingly mounting, and it will be, if I may say, also the responsibility of any conscious, decent, civilized human being to contribute whatever they can in terms of moral support or otherwise, in order to ensure not only in that part of the world but any other part of the world for no such an experience to repeat itself again.
I'd just like to ask you what kind of solidarity you've had from maybe organizations or governments outside of Sudan, both in Africa and in the wider diaspora.
Many of those governments, or states for that matter, that have understood the nature, history and reality of the conflict in Sudan are forthcoming with all sorts of enormous help, to which we are extremely thankful. Also, beyond Africa, there have been many genuine support from many different organizations here and there. But yet again, at a personal level, I believe more consolidation, more focus perhaps is needed in order to crystallize the collective human consciousness around these issues, such that action at a moral as well as a political level would be taken in a more serious way than is the case at present. For instance, the OAU, despite the continuity of this problem for all this time, is yet to discuss or even debate the issue of Sudan in a serious way. That is one thing. The second thing, the UN perhaps made a few gestures here and there, but none of them has been effective enough to bring into being a lasting, genuine settlement to the crisis in that country. So, yes, there have been many initiatives and helps from here and there, but what needs to happen, perhaps at a human basic level, perhaps to put together something of a solidarity organization of some sort, along the same lines of the anti-apartheid movement, for example, or any of the international well-known campaigning organizations, in order to inform the wider members of the international community about the details of what is actually happening, away from the short-sighted political manipulations that sometimes happen or take place due to some regional or whatever other national interest or calculations, and deal with it at the basic, most straightforward level, such that the wider international community or organizations that are representing any members of the international community in any specific area, or the Africans in the diaspora in particular, to participate in furthering the cause of peace and stability and bringing into being a genuine as well as a just settlement to this crisis. So there's a need for that. There's no doubt about that. And perhaps this will, in a more serious way, accelerate the process of peace in Sudan and get the practical steps to be taken in a more serious way to take place. That is at one level. At another level, there has been some kind of misinformation that is taking place about the crisis in Sudan. It's being Western backed, it's being Christians versus Muslims. No, I think the truth of the crisis is much more serious and profound than that. It is none of this, though yes, there are elements of that. So the reality of the Arab-African conflict, in my personal view, has been in existence long before there was such a thing as Western Europe, as we understand it today. So it is very much deeply rooted in history. It is very much deeply rooted in the dynamics of relations in that region. Let me borrow the words of Professor John Henry Clark, who said quite rightly that the Muslim-Arab encounter in Africa wasted about 1,000 years of African energy and African resources in real development terms. So that is absolutely true. So it is time now we redirect these energies and these creative abilities into more creative, into more developmental projects and ideas and things like that, rather than for us to continue over time around these kind of situations. Yes, also the world needs to know, for any genuine mobilization at an African level in Africa and in the diaspora and wider than that, to know the facts and the truth. Because if the facts and the truth will not be known in a clear-cut and ambiguous way, I think we are not likely to resolve anything. That is at one level. At another level, perhaps what Samuel Huntington said has a lot of truth in it. The Muslim borderlines are bloody in many ways. I'm sure this is not necessarily an SPLM official policy. That is not. This is my own personal view, and I entirely agree with the observations of Professor Samuel Huntington.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I noticed that you mentioned organizations like the United Nations, and people look to, I don't know, various organizations, OAU, Organization of African Unity. When you look at the history of their involvement in countries, I mean, the most obvious one is like the Rwanda, Zaire situation, right? When you look at the situations like that, what prospects are there for anything positive coming from their involvement?
This is a very good and valid question. Indeed, I mean, there are benefits that have been delivered through these institutions. We can't deny that. But on balance, unfortunately, the aspects rather than the positive the OAU is doing these days, I mean, it is in no way truly and genuinely reflective of the African people's needs, fears, worries, and things like that. It's nowhere near that. It is a club of some individuals who come to speak about some whatever issues that are nowhere in any way related to the day-to-day realities of African peoples on the ground. That is one thing. The second thing, the UN has been, perhaps as far as the Sudanese situation, is only beneficial as far as the OLS, the Operation Lifeline Sudan, the aid that is being given. That is something for which they are to be thanked and appreciated in every sense of the word. But what the UN could do at a political level, knowing the structure of the UN, for instance, the UN Security Council, for instance, could pass serious resolutions that will reflect the true and genuine reality of the Sudan, for instance. And I'm not being disrespectful of attempt on the life of Hosni Mubarak, but let us look at it. Has the UN the opportunity to see the realities of slavery, of genocide, of Islamization, of Arabization, and so forth, and the deaths of thousands, and now becoming into millions of people? Is all that not good enough, not important enough for it to justify a UN resolution of some sort? Or is it the life of one individual president that is so much valuable and so much important than the lives of millions of other Africans in Sudan? So this is a contradiction that sometimes baffles one's mind, and there are clear-cut questions. I'm sure this generation will not in any way forget these realities and will continue to ask questions and will continue to insist on these issues until some clear-cut answers are given to them, because I can't imagine knowing the future generations with my limited or perhaps good knowledge of the grassroots in many different places, that they are going to let these issues just pass away like that. The UN as well as the OAU will have a series of questions to answer as to what they did or why or how on earth they failed to do certain things in relation to the particularities of the Sudanese experience, notwithstanding the fact that in terms of calamities, in terms of destruction, in terms of sheer waste of resources and things of that sort, it is more serious and it is more catastrophic than perhaps what has been taking place in a number of other African countries, namely Somalia, if we speak of Rwanda, if we speak of Angola. Them put together will not in any way amount to the calamities and tragedies that are existing in Sudan. And sadly, there has also been a conspiracy of silence about the details of what is happening. A conspiracy of silence from many quarters. I mean, be they the media, be they politicians in this part of the world or many other parts of the world. That is in addition to perhaps some of the internal shortcomings that are to be addressed in a more coherent way in order to get the information out in a more clear way, in a more honest way, in a more straightforward way, in order to bring into being some serious solutions to this very tragic situation.
Hello, what's your name, where you're calling from?
Hello, my name is Martha. I'm from Birmingham. I'm listening to the conversation, and it seems quite interesting. But the press which you have from talking about the Sudanese, liberation, it keeps talking about Arabizing of Africa, of the Sudan. But really, isn't it the Indianization on a global scale? What we're talking about.
So did you see the Indianized?
Yeah, or Edomized. People with straight hair and sort of brownish skin, and the people who they're oppressing trying to look like that.
In some places there may well be an evidence of Indianized Africans, because everybody else wants to get their piece of the action when it comes to African people, but that is an issue. But it is not, historically speaking, and in view of what is happening today, something of any significance in terms of scale and gravity to what the
because I am African descent. My parents come from Jamaica.
Right.
Now to look at them, you wouldn't think there was Indian, but I have Indian traits in me, like my hair, shape my nose, whatever.
Right.
But because of the Indian population, which was brought over to the island of Jamaica, which worked for nothing. Right. You have this colonization, as it were, to speak. Where they control economics, the shops, the mental domination of black people, and I see myself as black, African.
I see. Let us not forget the fact that
it's happening everywhere.
Some of these Indians were brought to the Caribbean.
Because when I say Indian, I'm not saying like Indian as we know Indian. Right. I'm talking about that type of species of human being. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I understand your point, but also let us not forget the historical or the dynamics that brought them into this situation. But yes, of course, I agree with you. They came as a layer to continue the oppression of African people. That is no doubt. In fact, it's not only in the Caribbean. This happened in Uganda. It's happened in many parts of East Africa. Even in South Africa today. Even in South Africa today. I remember in one of the programs shown on BBC TV, one of the Indians said if his daughter going to get married to one of the Africans in South Africa, he's going to disown her. I said, my friend, if you want to behave like this in a country, how on earth do you want to benefit from its resources, from its potentials, and you sustain your livelihood, and yet you want to disrespect its people? I mean, these are the kind of things, I mean, which must raise many eyebrows, and some very serious political decisions need to be made about it. That is at one level. At another level, I remember one of my friends was telling me that the Indians, some of whom are mixed with the Africans in the Caribbean, there's this word dogla, which they use it as a derogatory term, especially in areas like Trinidad and Tobago and so forth. Yes, because they have
which they have control of now, actually.
You see, they have all of this false consciousness that they are essentially of better or higher stock than African people, which is not true.
Add on to that last point you made, because like I have 2 children, and the father is black. Yeah, but the parents is from French part of the Caribbean.
The Caribbean, I see.
But when my daughter was born, the first one, she had green eyes, and she had pale skin.
Right.
I am dark. Now, I watched the colour spectrum come through, you know, over time. And the same with the second one. She was pale, and she had a straight hair like the Indian hair. So I don't know why black people keep making themselves subservient to the Indian man when they create them.
Right.
You know, because all it is really is loving self, isn't it?
Well, you see, this is the irony behind it all, because if we look very deeply into history, that these patterns of thought and behavior and attitudes began with the African-Arab encounter, because when the Romans were occupying Egypt, before the Arabs come and take over, the Romans actually had at least a semblance of respect to the Africans, because they learned from their legacy, they borrowed from their ideas, they having that degree of respect for African. And in fact, even before the Islamic days, the earliest known connections between blackness and inferiority actually took place in Arabia, you see, before Islam. And that continued to date. If we study the classics of the Arab world very, very seriously, we discover people like Antar ibn Shaddad. This was a well-known fighter whose mother was Ethiopian and his father an Arab, and he was treated like a slave because of his mixed parentage. And he told us in a very coded way that he was hated for his color of skin, and he was treated as a slave as a result. So these are the early ideas that continue to confuse the references that are made to African people in general. But I don't think this is something which we have to, I don't want to say not to concern ourselves with. Yes, we should concern ourselves with, in order to seek serious solutions for it never to happen again, and for us to prepare all future generations not to dwell in these silly situations, and for us to collectively as well as individually to rise above it. You see, because at the end of the day, you are as good a human and as a valid a human being as any other. No one can in any way put you down because of your ancestral whatever. So these are the facts, and these are the realities we need to take very seriously.
I agree with you a lot. I see the world like a human garden, and each flower is individual but all valued.
Definitely.
But because the black genus, the black nucleus, when they look in the mirror, they don't like what they see, and it causes problems. I think even before the Arabs came, maybe that's what they was encountering, you know?
Well, I mean,
because you see on the street today, with a woman especially, straightening her hair, changing the skin color, not complimenting her skin tone, not glorifying who she is.
This is the sad reality. This is the sad reality. These are the sad realities which are resulting from the processes of falsifying our people's consciousness. So the processes of falsifying the African people's consciousness to be anything other than themselves has in one way or another brought into being these tragedies. But I'm beginning to believe that some clear-cut solutions for these are emerging, not only at the political level, i.e. human rights and so forth and so forth, even at a physiological level. The recent science and research and things like that of genetics and so forth are beginning to challenge these archaic ideas as to how they're no longer valid to even determine any details of human relations in that respect.
Because I used to, you know, hate myself completely, you know, just hate anything to do with black or whatever. But it took a turnaround for me, especially because I'm a woman. Look at other women and look at how they compliment each other, compliment themselves and love themselves. And that's why I learned to love myself and eventually start to love my children for who they are. Because as I said, they were born that way, but they look black. But you wouldn't. But to see them when they were first born, you wouldn't think, you know.
You do not need to hate yourself at all, because as I said, the beginning of wisdom is to know yourself. And the moment you know yourself and you stand by that fact, Because at the end of the day, no matter how a falsified consciousness may, be manipulated in many different directions, the truth will always emerge and prove itself that no matter what manipulation that may take place, it will always emerge in the end even stronger than it was at any time
Well,
before.
I agree with what you're saying. I'm proud to be of the Nubian, African, race, because for everything what we've gone through, we're still here today.
Absolutely.
We're still here today.
And we are here to stay.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, my sister. All right.
Bye.
Okay, thanks, Sam. How important do you see the links between the Africans on the continent and the Africans in the diaspora? Do you have any message for maybe people who are outside of the African continent who think, well, oh, that's an African problem, I'm from the West Indies, or I'm from the UK, or whatever like that, yeah?
In fact, this is a very wide question and very relevant and important question. Of course, there need to be even better and closer understanding of the historical realities that brought the worst and perhaps the most tragic of all tragedies, i.e. the Atlantic slave trade and so forth, that took our own people. When I am in the midst of my brothers and sisters in the West, I can relate and see many people who I know back home and see the similarities in terms of cultural values, in terms of many minute details as opposed to the secondary ones, which are similar in every sense of the word. So the challenge which is facing this generation in order to heal this 1,500 years old trauma that has traumatized not only Africans in the continent but also outside the continent, it will not happen not until and unless Africans in the diaspora and Africans in the continent sit together and sort out or perhaps even develop common strategies or whatever as to how to deal with this situation. I'm not saying it will necessarily mean that we have to treat our aggressors likewise, because that is not going to solve anything in any practical sense. But what we need to say to ourselves from this day onward, enough is enough and no more of this. Of course, I'm not saying that I'm not in support of ideas or initiatives like a reparation, apologies, and things of that nature. Of course, all these things are very valid and all these things are very essential if not only the humanity of the African is going to be restored, but the humanity of all of those who took part in bringing this tragedy into being, for it to be restored. So it's a very important issue that needs to be looked into from not only these limited aspects, areas that I've just mentioned. It needs to be looked into in a very comprehensive way, because the time has come for some Africans to refer to the Africans in the diaspora as some non-Africans. To me, that is nonsense. I mean, for instance, if a European comes from, call it Latin America or Australia or whatever, are they going to come back to Europe and be received as none other than Europeans? I mean, that is just nonsense. That is at one level. At another level, and this is what concerns me personally, is how the processes of cultural development, how the process of education development between these respective communities is going to take place. Perhaps it is time that they should sit together and sort out a few initiatives in order to put the future generations straight and at rest from these tragic experiences. Otherwise, they will continue to perpetuate and reproduce themselves over the time, because history works out like this. Until and unless someone actually takes a serious initiative or a serious action to stop something from happening, it will not just die away, or just through some wishful thinking, or let us say, okay, hope. Let us hope that tomorrow after tomorrow, Africans of the diaspora and the Africans in the continent are going to come together. No, that will never happen, just like that. So it is about time that these areas are looked into in a more detailed way. And as I said earlier, it's a vast, very vast issue that needs to be looked into in greater details. Because I find it, for instance, rather ridiculous. I mean, someone who's clearly African coming back to visit any of the African countries for that matter, and for instance, he would have to have a visa for it. I find that ridiculous. So these are wider issues that needs to be looked into in minute details. Some people may say, this is a fantasy, this is impossible, and whatever. Well, I don't really think so. I don't really think so. If it was by virtue of some action that took place that brought into being this very tragic destruction and this very tragic situation for our people to be in this condition, I think it should not be in any way impossible to take a positive, underlined positive action to restore these rights so that any African, wherever they are, they can go and exercise their full right into any part of African world as good as any other African.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's Deng from the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. Yeah, the next thing I'd like to ask you is, moving on from the relationships with people between the African continent and the African diaspora, when you see people who maybe converting to Islam or converting to Christian fundamentalism, and they're doing that in the West, right? How do you, as somebody who like actually lives on the front line of maybe not necessarily the brand of Islamism that they're dealing with, but one aspect of Islam, how do you feel when you see people run into Islam when you know that when you live under Sharia law, certain things happen, you know? So yeah, if you could just maybe talk about that.
As I said earlier in my brief introduction, that Islam, as far as the experiences that are taking place in Sudan today, has provided the philosophical and ideological foundations, come justifications for much of what is happening there today. There is a very famous fatwa that Islamically justifies the enslavement, appropriation of Africans' property, and even genocide. That is one thing. It is also a well-known fact that a senior member of the National Islamic Front government in Sudan, in the presence of 4 foreign ministers of Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, and the person I'm talking about is Dr. Ghazi Salahuddin, he said, we do not actually want to Islamize and Arabize as well as civilize, quote-unquote, Southern Sudan, i.e. where the Africans are. We want to take over the rest of Africa. So in such an amazing way. So Islam did in many ways provide some of these justifications. There's no doubt about that. But in essence, and I'm here very much impressed by the observation of one of our senior brothers, Lester Lewis, who said genuine Christianity is actually a celebration of African culture, heritage, and legacy. And the same could be said of Islam. Genuine Islam, in its true spirit, is a celebration of African culture, legacy, and heritage. There's no doubt about that, since even now researchers and writers are beginning to investigate this area even more seriously. That is at one level. At another level, the Islam that began as a social reformation movement in Arabia around the 6th century, when it came to Africa, was very much an Arab construct built around the Arab culture proper. So this will bring us to what giants and elders of the caliber of Dr. Yusuf Benjukanan, who said religion is a deification of a people's culture, which is absolutely true. So the Islam which is built around the Arab culture came with Arab baggage, which is very much at odds with the African reality, the African culture, the African sense of community in many ways. And also there are similarities in many ways. That is not to be forgotten as well. So the processes of Islamization actually took place at a time when there was a vacuum, so to speak. I mean, many Africans accepted the idea of Islam when there were some similarities seen here and there. But when Islam actually took roots and the other side of the coin was becoming evident to those who became Muslims, the process of Arabization began and the destruction of African communities took place. And that is how the whole northern part of the continent is an Arab today, and the Africans are increasingly beginning to be pushed further and further and further into the hinterlands of the continent. Some of those who are in the West who became Muslim because of some of the communities who were taken and sold into slavery in those very early days were Islamized and not necessarily Arabized. That was a historical fact as well. And in recent years, the new wave of Islamization that is taking place in the West perhaps was intensified by virtue of the fact that there is a genuine frustration with the oppression, with the experiences that are being lived on a daily basis by the Africans in the West. So they wanted to seek some kind of alternative and a radical departure from the reality of oppression and so forth. And they sought comfort in Islam as a religion. But very few of them do know or do realize that Islam was one of those very tools that were once used to bring their own ancestors and their own forebearers and reduce them to this very situation. Very few even people, or perhaps in many well-informed institutions of whatever learning standards in the world, are fully aware of this, and the few of them who are fully aware of this do not go out and share this information with the wider communities. So the example of Sudan will definitely raise many, many serious questions, not only to African Muslims outside the continent, but African Muslims inside the continent, some of whom are in Sudan itself. Yes, it is being argued that it is not Islam, but it is how Islam is being implemented. It is how Islam is being interpreted. But okay, how on earth or up to when are we going to disassociate between Islam as a religion or a body of beliefs and ideas and how it is being interpreted and implemented? This argument can no longer hold any water. I mean, there will have to come a time when the political will and the strength of argument as it stands will have to be made very clear for all people. I personally hope what I'm saying will not be interpreted or misunderstood that I'm anti-Islamic. No, I'm not. I have a lot of very good Muslims in the West or from Africa. But when we sit together and discuss the details of this, a lot of them are increasingly becoming to realize these excesses, and a lot of them are increasingly becoming to know as to how the processes of Islamization took part in the destruction of the African reality, if not very existence in many areas. For instance, I was reading one of the Arabic newspapers called Al-Hayat, which spoke about the Fulanis who are in Mauritania. They held a conference, and in that conference, by some magical whatever intervention, they decided that they are no longer Africans, they are Arabs, with some ancestor coming from some tribe called Beni Humer. So these are the amazing realities people will continue to accept. But also, the question is to be raised to the Africans themselves. Having known or being aware of such information, what action each and every individual within him or herself, as well as the wider community, are going to do in order to bring into being a better and a new reality. I don't know. I'm not too sure of how it's going to take shape in terms of minute details. But in relation to Islam in particular, I'm not too sure. I admire one brother who said, if the issue of religion is the deification of people's culture, why do I have to deify other people's culture? Why don't I deify my own culture? You see, so I said to him, my brother, you have a point. So as to what or how the details of that are going to be, I honestly do not know. You see, but before us is the evidence of how these very bodies of beliefs and ideas contributed towards the destruction of what we see today. And also, one of the things that I find extremely alarming, and I speak as someone who once participated in that belief system, is the position of the woman. There was no time before the African woman has ever been reduced to such depths of degradation, not until Islamization and Arabization was introduced properly in any given community. So these fault lines need to be looked into. These fault lines need to be addressed in a very serious and straightforward way if we are to move on to a better reality and release our constrained energies into more creative and inventive ways of doing things.
Okay, thank you, Brother Deng, for expanding on that. It's getting towards the end of the show. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to let him, if there's anything that he wants to add about the situation or what he would like to see happening.
First of all, I would like to thank Brother Kubara and what is actually happening now, or what happened before, or what is likely to happen in the near future with respect to the situation in Sudan. I would have hoped to add more and interact with the callers if they have any questions and queries and things like that. Perhaps we will have maybe a better opportunity and advertise it well before time. Perhaps 3 weeks or 4 weeks in advance. And when we come and sit down and talk together and reason through the details of this experience and reflect upon them through our own individual experiences as well, such that I'm sure a better and a clearer picture of the African world experience will emerge as a result. Because we have to take a conscious action collectively as well as individually in order to bring into being a better reality and a better, more civilized and humanized situation than what is happening not only to us but to the world in general. I mean, there have been a lot of misinformations that are taking place through the media and so forth that reflects and projects Africans as so and so and so and so, whereas very little about the positive aspects of things that is being discussed as well. I would love also to come perhaps at a future time to discuss with you and share with you some of the positive things that are happening, which hopefully will bring into being a better reality, not only for us as Africans in any part of the African world, but hopefully to the wider human family, so to speak. So until we find another chance to get together and reason around these issues, I wish you all the best. And thanks again to Brother Kubara.
Thanks, Deng, yeah, most definitely. Everybody that comes on the show gets an invite back, yeah, you know, because sometimes some people are just like chilling out in their house, they're just listening, taking in the information. So although, I mean, some people judge their show on how many calls you get, I just look on the opportunity for a man to put out information about what's going on around about the world concerning Africans. Okay, caller, yeah?
Yes, big respect. Yeah, I would just like to say I found the show today. It's the first time I'm tuning in at this hour because I normally listen to the show on Sundays.
All right, okay, yeah.
But I'd like to say that I was very much educated and impressed with the way the brother, put forward what he had to say today. And I would really like him to come back again so that I could get the full program and be able to contribute or, ask some questions, because a lot of things I would really like to know still about Africa that I don't know. And this brother, in fact, this brother, he sounds like somebody I saw on TV when I was discussing the Rwanda issue one time. I don't know if it's him, but it sounds like him.
I don't know. I'll let you talk to him. So what's your name? Where are you calling from?
Sorry, my name is Raymond, and I'm calling from Detroit.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't know if he was on TV talking about Rwanda, but I'll let him speak to you anyway, yeah? Okay,
yeah.
Deng, yeah?
Right. Yes, Brother Raymond.
Yes, Deng, respect to the maximum.
Respect. I'm glad you made this through, because you see, it's time, as we say, we share and reason around all the challenges that we are facing as a people and things. And the similarities of our experiences are so much the same. In a way,
Sure.
sometimes, we say, hey, wait a minute, some of these things are happening. I mean, I remember telling one of the sisters that the slavery which is taking place in Sudan today, some of the children are actually taken away from their mothers and sold to other slave owners and things like that. And she said, does that happen too? I said, yes, my sister, it's happening too. So,
You have to come back, brother. You have to come back.
the similarities are so unbelievable.
Yeah, that is new to me. I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it's true. It's new to me as well.
Right.
It is.
I would love to come back again and share with you many details about this, and also perhaps put in there some addresses and phone numbers and things like that for those who are interested to follow up with these stories. And I'm sure the knowledge will reach out, despite the fact that a lot of it is being suppressed and manipulated for all kind of limited and short-sighted interests.
Mm-hmm.
But one believes that in one way or another, the truth will always come out.
I believe that. Yes,
All right, my brother. Okay.
All right, thanks again.
All right.
Respect.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Raymond, yeah? NUBIART, a different perspective on the African world.